Hello everyone and welcome to another Martian Colonist live stream. For all of you who've been following me, thanks for persevering today as we had a few minor technical details associated with this lovely new microphone setup which I have here, which hopefully should improve the audio quality in the live stream. So in my last Mars mission update in July, we heard about some really exciting developments that both SpaceX and Boeing are moving ahead with on preparing for the Commercial Crew program. At the end of the video, I asked you to cast your minds a little bit further ahead into the future, to think about what a society on Mars when we have around 1,000 people could be like. And many of you sent in your comments. I received a total of about 600 comments over the past 2 weeks, which was remarkable overall. And in particular, I was really excited to see that one of the faux pas, if you will, of YouTube is starting conversations about politics in comments. Now, in this case, obviously my channel is much more of a scientific channel. We focus on technical details, but I asked you to talk about different political structures, how you would see a Martian society governed, and overall the quality of the discussion was excellent. It was very well moderated, and I was really, really impressed, so good job everyone. So let's start the live stream by casting our minds forward. Imagine you have just launched yourself on the way to Mars, let's say on one of SpaceX's big Falcon rockets. You fly through the atmosphere, and as you cruise, you imagine what your future job will be on the red planet. Now, you certainly will have a lot of time to decide. You'll actually have 3 months overall. But when you finally arrive at Mars, the time will then arrive to make an ultimate decision. What will your future role be on the red planet? What job will you have in the first city on the planet Mars? This was the first of 2 main questions that I asked you all, and a number of you sent in some really interesting insights on what kind of jobs you thought would be useful on a Martian colony. So I will start off this with Colin from Colin Sinclair, who was interested in the kind of scientific or engineering backgrounds that Martian colonists would need in order to make the base actually work, and whether someone like himself, a civil engineer, would be useful. So in general terms, I would at least envision that the very first crew that would go to Mars, let's say for the sake of argument you had a group of 10 to 20 people, most of them would have to be engineers just purely based on getting all the systems to work. But you would also require quite a lot of redundancy on the medical side. So you would need a lot of people trained both in basic first aid, but also fully trained doctors. So that if, for instance, you had an accident and in the worst case scenario, let's say, you might even lose a third of your crew, just to put a concrete number out there. You need to make sure that you haven't lost all of your doctors. So engineers and doctors, I imagine, will be most useful. The specific specialities probably doesn't matter that much, because for the very first crews that would go to Mars, they would undergo extensive training in many, many different disciplines. So I suppose the only broad thing you can say, at least for maybe the first 100 people on Mars, is try and make sure that you have a wide general set of skills on top of just basic scientific literacy. So Ludwig raised the point that one of the particular jobs that would be really useful beyond just doing scientific research would be about mining and then growing food on Mars. This point was developed in some other comments, in particular from Christopher, who raised the excellent point that you'll actually need a lot of people able to cook things on Mars, and it would actually be fascinating imagining what would be the kind of delicacies that would end up being created on Mars. Now, I should say for all of you watching live, I am monitoring the live comments feed over on the right-hand side. So if you do have anything that you would like to suggest or jump in at any point, by all means, please just drop your comments over there. And every now and then I will stop looking at some of the previous comments from my last video and take a look at what some of you are saying live. But back to jobs on the first Martian colony. So Anne raised the point that besides just standard roles like engineers, scientists, doctors, etc., before you have very radical automation, for instance, on Mars, you're going to need a lot of people just doing simple jobs, even things you might not expect, like cleaners, hairdressers, receptionists, etc. My personal viewpoint on this is probably that a lot of those skills, at least if you have a, say, 10-year training program, you probably can split amongst the first people that go, instead of, for instance, having one person who's a dedicated hairdresser in the first 100 people that you have on Mars. So I see a lot of you saying in the comments about 3D printing technology. This will absolutely be vital. So I would imagine that one of the most crucial jobs that you would have early on Mars would be someone capable of fixing and repairing a 3D printer. Because if your 3D printer is one of the key ways that you're obtaining replacement tools and spare parts, for instance, if your 3D printer breaks, you've got an absolute catastrophe. I see one of my moderators, Miguel, is there. How are you doing over there in Spain? Saying that software engineers would absolutely be required on Mars. Absolutely, because without software, hardware is pretty much pointless and useless. So another of the jobs we heard about last time. Now this was a point that I really, really liked, that was emphasized by Alexandra. Namely that maybe our entire concept of jobs and work, as we've developed on Earth, doesn't necessarily apply to the planet Mars. Because, for instance, you go to a job, you get paid, for instance, you're then being rewarded. But what if, for instance, people on Mars just do whatever tasks need to get done? It's set up almost like a mission architecture. In that sense, you then wouldn't even necessarily require jobs on Mars, which I thought was a very fascinating point overall. So we've heard about a number of potential jobs that could be useful for the first few people on Mars. But jobs is only one small part of how you would actually structure a Martian society. You would also have to consider what legal frameworks you have, what laws you have on Mars, and later on in the live stream I will be touching upon whether Martians could potentially have a constitution and what might need to be included in that. But the big part of this live stream that I really want to focus on is about the potential government structures on Mars. Now, of course, debates about politics on the internet can always tend to get very heated, so to the greatest extent possible, I'm going to try and be balanced here and present a representative sample of all the different ideas that you shared with me in the last live stream. In the last video, I should say. So, let's go and dive straight into some of the comments that we saw about potential governments. So, we'll start with a comment from Ted Bear, who started off by saying that ultimately the big dividing step for deciding what kind of government structure you're going to have on Mars will be when it becomes a self-sustaining settlement. And that could actually take decades after you have your first landing. So there will probably be some kind of natural dividing point in time between early Martian government systems, which could be very top-down, they could be governed from the Earth, for instance, versus the kind of government structures that you might expect Martians themselves to organically grow. Because, of course, Martian settlements over time will start very simple, they will grow in complexity, and obtain additional redundancy over time. So that's why I emphasise the point of having about 1,000 people on the Red Planet, because that might be the point when you might start having to consider people having full-time jobs as politicians, dare I say, for instance. So let's take a look at some other comments. So Paul Bland started an interesting line of reasoning, which is actually a proposed government system that I haven't seen proposed before. Namely that, what if you treat the first Martian society with a kind of corporate government structure? So the way that Paul suggests it is that you would have a CEO at the top, various departmental managers, and ultimately what you would do is you would have the different departmental managers being specialists in various different areas. So this overall argument of having a corporate structure seemed to be incredibly popular overall amongst many of your comments. For example, Nathan Forrester said that absolutely you would need to have a corporate operation to start, where you could have a company, in his particular case he considers it to be SpaceX founding the settlement, that would start it off. But interestingly enough, Nathan goes down a route of nationalization almost, in proposing that you would start off by having it be a corporate endeavour, and then eventually you could have a government on the Earth taking over the endeavour. This isn't actually too dissimilar from what we saw historically with the colonization of the Americas. And I don't know that much about many of the other European countries apart from the United Kingdom that was doing this. But in the case of the UK, it was really driven by companies doing this right at the beginning. Lots of investors would pool their resources together. They would then sponsor an expedition to then go out there and establish a settlement, and then the investors would then expect a financial return. And it was only later on that you would obtain nationalisation taking place, which seems to be along the lines that Nathan is proposing there. So another of the comments about this in how a corporate structure would actually work in practice, in this particular comment by 24K Golden Rocket, talking about a corporate meritocracy, which is a term that I found absolutely fascinating. Namely that, based on the productivity of people in the Martian settlement, you could award them shares in the colony corporation, such that the people who are most productive overall would ultimately have a greater share. And that way you would be rewarding people who contribute the most to the colony, and that way you could avoid, for instance, having people as full-time politicians, because if they're not actually contributing something concrete to the colony, they wouldn't have any overall votes and any overall power, which I thought was a really interesting overall idea. Now, not everyone amongst your comments was particularly enthused with the idea of having a top-down corporate structure. Some people were very interested in having everything being mandated from the Earth. For instance, you could have some kind of military structure, for instance, as was proposed by Eldon Crom, who said that ultimately, because it's going to be a long time until a Martian colony can self-fund itself, you need to make sure that you have an overall order which is separate from just profit motives, as you might fall victim to if you have a corporate structure. So he said you should have a commanding officer, which you would rotate very frequently from the Earth, to ensure that you don't just have a single person responsible for running everything on Mars. And then ultimately, maybe you could transition to some kind of democratic structure later on in the process. So taking a look at some of your comments overall. So all of you there who are watching live, by all means, just drop your comments over there and let's see what people are saying. So the Maker Show says that you shouldn't have an Earth base on Mars. What's most important is being independent. So this could indeed be another time-dependent thing, in that, let's say, for instance, that you're on Mars. You want to make sure you have a continual supply of supply shipments being sent to you for anything that you can't replace. And that means, to a certain extent, you will be dependent on the Earth. But the question then is, are you dependent on a government? Or are you dependent, for instance, on a collective of people that have some kind of vested interest in the Martian outpost, which I would argue would be a more sustainable way of doing it, because the last thing you want is to be on Mars and be having top-down regulation from the Earth being sent to you, which may not just blatantly be efficient with the unique problems that you'll face on Mars. So, Starbat says that there needs to be some checks on balances, and if you have a corporate government ruled by a CEO with no democratic oversight, you could be very susceptible to corruption. This is a very prescient point, and indeed many people in the comments on my last video also spoke about this. So let's go on and examine some of the comments that you left on democracies and how that could potentially work on Mars. So Infinita Salo started off this discussion by saying that a direct democracy may be the best ultimate options. We'll revisit his point about technocracies later on, because you can have some issues with a direct democracy. So for those of you who don't know, a direct democracy would be something very different than most of the democracies that we have here on Earth at the moment, which tend to be representative democracies. In a direct democracy, on all really important issues, you would have every single citizen that is part of that democracy able to vote on those particular issues. And that naturally raises some issues in that you can be subject to a classic issue of what's called the tyranny of the majority, where, let's say, for instance, the majority of people are not informed on a particular issue. Let's say, for instance, you had a vote on whether to expand a nuclear reactor on the Martian base. Now, based on much of the public's perception, at least on the Earth, of nuclear reactors, that probably wouldn't get passed, even if people who were specialists in the nuclear field knew it was completely safe and that it was vital for the energy security of the colony, it then still wouldn't happen because of people being misinformed. So you have to make sure for a direct democracy to work that the majority of people are well informed about the issue at hand. But on Mars, that may indeed be the case. So as this point is really well emphasised by ADD Dude, who said that those 1,000 people that you have on Mars, at least compared to people on the Earth, will generally tend to be quite smart and socially capable, probably because you will have had extensive psychological profiling, and ultimately the people going to Mars in the very first cruise will need to have a vast array of technical knowledge which will be very well developed. So it may be the case, interesting enough, that Mars could be the very first place where a direct democracy could actually work, which would be very interesting. So can some of you let me know in the comments live now? So if you had a direct democracy and you could vote on any particular issue, do you think that would work on Mars? And what kind of issues do you think would be important to the Martians for actually voting on? And then I'll take a look in a minute or so at some of your suggestions. Daniel Suter was also really interested in the issues of democracy on Mars. He said also that he thought direct democracy would probably be the best system overall, but he was very concerned about the potential drawbacks of the media system on Mars. Because if you have a media which is very influential and is able to, in many ways, shift people's viewpoints very subtly using advanced techniques like machine learning, for instance, but I won't get too much into that, that you then have the problem that whoever controls the media could ultimately control the democracy. So direct democracy is not necessarily the best system overall. As I said, you have to make sure that everyone is well informed. So, some of your comments, let's take a look. So, Wardstone111 says maybe you could have a cross of the two systems that we've talked about. Referendums on major decisions, and perhaps a group of representatives on deciding policy on some of the smaller issues. Maybe you could have some kind of Council of Mars, for instance, that would be made up of specialists, which is one idea that I particularly like myself. So, for instance, key roles you might have on Mars. Let's say you would have someone who is managing the energy systems, someone who is responsible for managing the food, someone for, security and policing within Mars. All of these roles could be made up of specialists that then form part of a big committee that then makes centralized decisions. But again, you'd have to make sure that you have some kind of system of most of the people on Mars having a direct say in that. So, let's see, other points. So, Folks Eve, one of our wonderful moderators, says that he thinks that at the 1,000 person level, you'd have to make sure that you have enough trust in experts to leave decisions to them, even if you had a vote in the manner there. So, this is a worrying trend that we're seeing a lot right here on the Earth at the moment, distrust in experts, and as a scientist myself, it's something that really concerns me. Because if you don't believe, if someone becomes an expert and you don't recognize their qualifications, you don't recognize their contributions, then you can be in a situation where you just always have debates on a level playing field between someone who has spent almost their entire life working on something and someone who just randomly says something because they thought it was a good idea. And so we really have to make sure in governing a Martian society that experts and people who know the most about particular areas really have a chance to actually implement those overall. Because on Mars, it's critical for survival, really. If you put someone in charge of the air supply, for instance, who doesn't know how you can filter air, for instance, to use a very extreme example, obviously that won't be good for the colony. We've looked at a few people really emphasizing democracy. Let's take a look at some people proposing different systems now. So we did have a few comments, and this started a few quite heated debates with people advocating socialist systems on Mars. So here I'm highlighting one comment from, how do I pronounce this? Krasny, saying that Mars could be the ideal playing ground to test socialist ideas overall, because you could enable the workers and the people themselves to control the means of production, because ultimately the means of production is vital for survival on Mars, because it doesn't just include things like growing your own food, but also your own air supply overall. Another person in favour of potentially a socialist or communist system was Alex Dowland, who said that perhaps if you had a communist-type government where decisions are made by people with the best knowledge overall for the benefit of everyone, maybe that would work the best. So that's just to throw that out there for some people who might be interested in seeing that work. In particular, Alex's comment that we just heard sounded less like a communist system to me and more like a meritocratic technocracy, for instance, where you have people who know the most about a particular area having the direct says. Okay, so I see a few comments have been directed at me. So Abu Talha al-Somali says that I am incorrectly assuming that there will be a single unified Martian society when there could be many countries competing. You're absolutely right. Up to this point in this discussion, I have just been considering a single Martian base and imagining that all of the people living on Mars would actually be there. Now, of course, as you correctly point out, there could be many different splinter groups on Mars. The reason that I was making that assumption is because it's so much more difficult to survive on Mars, it becomes a lot more difficult for someone to just pack up their bags, move somewhere else, and start a new settlement. So let me know what you think. Do you think that by the time we reach 1,000 people or so, you'll already have different splinter groups, people going off, not agreeing with the main Martian collective and founding their own settlements? Because if so, I think Mars could actually be a place for us to conduct some fascinating political experiments. Because on Mars we could have the chance to try brand new political systems that have never even been tried on the Earth before. So, I really like the quote from Winston Churchill, for instance, that democracy is the worst form of government apart from all the other forms that have been tried. The natural logical extension of that argument is, well, why don't you try some new ones and see if you can come up with an even better system? And towards the end of this live stream, I will talk about what overall system, based on your comments, I suspect would probably work best on Mars. So, more of your comments. Let's see. Anti-Fusion says that he thinks anyone with enough intelligence knows that working together as a species is more viable on Mars. I would certainly like to hope so, because on Mars you have to work together just to survive. It's not going to be easy. And in fact, I would really like to hope that people on Earth who are watching these early fledgling societies developing on Mars, perhaps some of them will be inspired to think in the long term about how such ideas could be implemented back on the Earth if indeed the Martians do develop a more collaborative political system. So, a few more of your comments from last time. So, Making Sense said, and Making Sense is a fan of Kim Stanley Robinson's Mars trilogy, by the way, which if you haven't read, I highly recommend you read it, advocating some kind of post-capitalist economic model, where instead of having capital investment driving the industry, instead what you could have overall is having the workers owning the industry and hiring the capital, which is actually different from traditional notions of socialism. So, as I recall, in Kim Stanley Robinson's novel, he looked at a way that you need to couple the ownership of not just industry, but also the environment into a kind of environmental economic model. In particular, the Mars trilogy was really focused on the concept of terraforming, which I will touch upon in maybe 10 minutes or so, and how when you have collectives of people on Mars, they have to also decide who has the ability and the rights to actually modify the environment. So you have to couple the economic system with the environmental system. So let's see some more of your comments. I see there's a lot of your comments streaming by, so if some of you are particularly keen to get a shout out, just tag me by pressing at and then type my name, for instance, and then it should be slightly easier for me to see some of your comments then. So let's see. Some of you seem to be talking about digital systems of government now, and whether you could have an artificial intelligence assisting the leadership, which is an idea that I haven't actually seen suggested in the comments of my last video, which is very fascinating. So how many of you think that humans as a whole cannot be trusted to make the most responsible decisions? Could it be the case that an artificial intelligence, whose single goal is to ensure that the colony itself survives, would make the best government. Just thinking out loud off the top of my head, I think that you still need to make sure that the colony itself has representatives and is still being governed by humans who are specialists in each area. But I think what might be helpful is, let's say on whatever kind of governing committee you have, or Council of Mars, or whatever you want to call it, perhaps the artificial intelligence has a veto on certain decisions, so that if the AI calculates that a certain action is very likely, let's say at greater than 99.5% certainty, to cause the colony to go extinct and to wipe out the life there, the AI can then veto that decision. That might be an interesting compromise overall. So, a few more of your ideas. Turning now to the exciting idea of technocracies. So, Fox Eve raised the point that perhaps we shouldn't have a system like we have already on the Earth. Maybe we don't need a democracy, we don't need a socialist system. What if we have a technocracy, where you still have votes on issues? People still get a say. But what you instead do is you weight people's votes overall by their technical knowledge. So if there is a vote on, so let's say, using genetically modified food, for instance, in the Martian colony, then if you have someone who is responsible for growing the food and they know there's a food shortage and the only way around that is genetically modified crops, they should get more says. So I just see we've had a super chat through from Blake Schmitz. Thanks very much for that. And saying that he appreciates my impartiality. Yeah, I really am trying here to make sure that we present a balanced view. I know many of you will have really strong opinions, depending on, in many cases, where you were grew up in the world, about different political structures. And so, although I myself have grown up in a democracy, what I really like doing is applying the scientific method in analysing different political systems and trying to objectively think, maybe that system could be better, or maybe that could be worse, and looking at all of the drawbacks. And on Mars, we have a fascinating chance to study these different systems and see if they actually work, and what the drawbacks could be. Turning now to the legal systems on Mars, which is an entirely other really interesting topic. And apologies for some of those vehicles passing by here. So Carl said that, and this is a point that has been emphasized by Elon Musk on a few occasions, that Martian laws should be simple, everyone should be able to understand them. And this is a really important point, because how many of you have actually read the laws that different governments on the Earth have, and how many of you understand them? And I know that I certainly don't know that much about the intricate workings of the legal system. I might be able to articulate certain laws, but knowing about loopholes in the law is something that I would have to then go and consult a lawyer on if I really wanted to know about in detail. So I really like this idea of making laws on Mars as simple as they can be, but not too simple that they are then open to exploitation, which is something you have to be really careful of. Elon Musk has emphasized on a few occasions that you should make sure that the laws automatically expire if they aren't renewed, to make sure that you don't get very arcane laws overall. Let's see, a few more of your comments. Let's take a look. So, Alloy says, would Mars have a military base? That really depends on if Mars is being settled by governments primarily, who have some kind of military interest there, whether you get splinter groups, as we talked about earlier, or whether you have corporations. I mean, are there any... Traditionally, military bases are there to protect some kind of interest. Often it could be resource interest, for instance. So what kind of resources could there be on Mars? Because if I had to think about this, and sorry about this coming out all the time, I was a little rushed in preparing for the technology today. So the resources on Mars. I mean, so some people left comments about having mining bases on Mars, for instance, like old-fashioned mining towns, which I suspect probably won't happen on Mars, just due to the sheer expense of shipping material out of the gravity well of Mars. However, one of the key resources would probably be something that you can transmit at the speed of light, namely ideas. So if you had intellectual property interests on Mars, perhaps developed by a corporate base, then they might start hiring private security forces to protect their intellectual property. So maybe that would be the kind of military structures you could see on Mars, if indeed it does eventually turn into something like that. So let's turn to a really exciting topic that many of you had comments on: the constitution of Mars. And indeed, should we have a constitution on Mars? So John Pepin started this off by saying that before we even decide on a government system, we need to write up a constitution on the Earth, decide what the key principles will be, such that people who are going on their way to Mars on the BFR or some other associated vehicle know exactly what they are signing up for and what their protections are. Some other key points raised along this point, for example by Jeff A., said that we should be thinking about this right now, which is actually one of the reasons why I really wanted to hold this live stream, in that you should, at least Jeff suggests, that you should gather constitutional scholars and experts from free world countries in democracies and let the experts meet to identify what would be the basis, potentially, of a Martian constitution. And this point was really interesting because this has actually already happened. So I remember reading an article on the BBC about 4 years ago concerning a meeting where constitutional experts had gathered to come up with a Bill of Rights for Mars, looking at what kind of basic assumptions you would require for that. And after this stream is concluded, I'll make sure to post a link to this article in the description if you want to read it. But one of the big takeaways overall that I recall was that on Mars, you need to ensure that one of the most fundamental things inscribed in the Bill of Rights or the Constitution is the right to have breathable air on Mars, which is not something we even think about on the Earth, for instance. But if you have someone who controls the air supply in a Martian settlement, they have absolute control. You could have a dictatorship established if someone can just turn off the air supply at will, for instance. So that probably would be one of the most fundamental aspects. And indeed, I suspect that the key ideas that a Martian constitution were based on probably will all be around the concepts of resources needed to survive on Mars and making sure that everyone has access to those. So, another point about the Martian constitution that Sid Psycho raised is that we've been assuming in a lot of these points that the people living on Mars are free individuals and therefore would need to be protected by some kind of constitution overall. And that might not necessarily hold if we have a corporate structure, like we've already discussed today. So this is a very good point. I mean, I don't think it applies indefinitely, because in the early years, sure, you could have a top-down structure where ultimately the survival of the settlement comes before everything. But eventually, I'm quite confident that the Martian settlement will indeed become independent, and they will then need to decide on what they are going to do. So let me ask you about that. Do you think we should decide on a constitution for Mars before we go, or is that something that we should leave up to the Martians when they actually get there and are faced with these extraordinary challenges? Or perhaps you could have a compromise where you decide on very basic rights that everyone has on Mars. A simple bullet point list, for instance, that anyone can understand before you sign up to go, and then the Martians write a detailed constitution later on. Let me know what you think about that over in the chat. So, Glenn Goodale has just asked me in all caps, what will you do about religion on Mars? Which is, this is a comment that came up. This came up a few times in the comments on my last video, and I wasn't going to talk about it, but since you asked about that, so I mean, this is one area where the internet always explodes into arguments. You get a lot of people who are very saying we should not have any kind of religion on Mars, for instance, we should make it entirely independent. Other people take a less extreme viewpoint where they say perhaps you shouldn't have organised religion on Mars, but anyone should be free to think and believe whatever they want. I don't think that we should restrict anyone from going to Mars if they are the right person to go to Mars and can make a big contribution there. Personally, I'm not religious myself, but I don't think we should hold back people if they can make a big contribution. And I'm sure some of you will have many strong opinions on both sides of this, and it's not a debate that I want to get too much into here. But that's where I broadly stand on it, that anyone who can contribute to the Martian society, so long as their beliefs are not getting in the way of building a Martian society, making sure that everyone can survive and prosper, then ultimately people's beliefs don't matter that much. It's only when beliefs impinge on successful society building and life on Mars that I think it's an issue. Okay, so with that one out of the way, let's see a few more of your comments. So, Kelvin says that government should sign an agreement not to build military bases on other planets and leave global war out of their planetary bases. Well, I mean, governments have already signed the Outer Space Treaty, which kind of does this and stops the militarization of bodies elsewhere in the solar system. I will be really... I mean, I'm sure some of you have heard the news more recently about the Space Force being planned to be established in the United States, for instance, and it remains to be seen the extent to which that could potentially be in tension with the Outer Space Treaty. But the problem is always, whenever we look back at human history, it seems to always be that whenever there is a resource that is valuable, it doesn't necessarily have to be just something you dig up from the ground and process. It could be a human resource. That's when you tend to get militaries trying to protect that interest. So I personally would like to see Mars free of the military, but I suspect that once you reach a certain threshold of people, hey, even if you don't have governments on Earth establishing military bases on Mars, you might then start to see the Martians themselves worried about protecting their own interests, perhaps from Earth corporations. So it's probably something that will inevitably happen in the future. Okay, a few more of your points. Let's see. So a number of you have talked about tickets to Mars, one-way tickets versus return tickets. In particular, Anti-Fusion was just talking about this. So I suspect, at least initially, for the first few people who go there, maybe even the first 100 people who go to Mars, it probably will be a one-way trip because that's the simplest way to do it. You want to keep the expertise and the skills there, but further on down the line, you'll be able to cycle people. I would actually be quite interested to see whether you could have a system where someone on the Earth might... let's say they had a really crucial skill set that could be used on Mars. Perhaps they would do a tour of duty, if you will, of the Martian colonies, where they sign up to a company to work for 10 years on Mars. They get sent over there, 3 months there, 3 months back. They complete their work there, and when they return to Earth, or perhaps they could choose to stay on Mars if they so desired, they would then receive a very large salary for that. In particular, there would be large hazard pay because they're being exposed to radiation going to Mars and then coming back. Less so on the surface if the Martian base has sufficient radiation shielding. Let me know what you think about that. There's so many fascinating ideas, and I see loads of you are chatting now about the Outer Space Treaty from 1967, which I agree probably is quite outdated, and I would imagine when we actually have the first landing on Mars, or hopefully sooner, space lawyers will have to seriously consider revamping that. But for the last part of the live stream, before I throw it open just to really general comments that all of you are sending in, I want to look a little bit further ahead than just the 1,000 people mark and think about how societies on Mars will deal with the really big question that many of you will be excited by, and I know first got me interested in Mars, as you can see from my t-shirt, wherever it's not partially obscured, which is the question of terraforming Mars. Which ultimately, if you have a society on Mars, it would be in their vested interest to actually do. And this is a topic that's been in the media a lot just over the last few weeks, and I am going to be examining this in a lot more detail in my next Mars mission update concerning a recent study which has been examining the feasibility of building up CO2 concentrations on Mars. But for those of you who don't know, the broad idea is we start with the Mars that we have today, which is a very lifeless world, a very thin atmosphere, only about 1% of the Earth's atmosphere, and we use ingredients which are either locally on Mars or we import ingredients, for example, from comets, in order to thicken the atmosphere, starting to increase the natural greenhouse effect on Mars, warming it up until liquid water can then be stable, and eventually oxygenating the atmosphere so that people can go out on the surface and breathe, and we have created another Earth-like planet. So if the founding drive, really, of an advanced city on Mars, once you reach maybe 100,000 or 1,000,000 people becomes terraforming the planet. This causes all manner of interesting political questions. Because let's say we have splinter groups on Mars, as we discussed earlier. What if you have some settlements on Mars that are vehemently opposed to terraforming, and they try and stop the endeavours? Maybe, dare I say it, this could lead to some of the first terrorist activity on Mars. If you have some people trying to sabotage initiatives to terraform the Red Planet. We're obviously looking way, way, way into the future on this particular issue here. But I'm sure some people will be very vehemently against terraforming. So you could have corporate interests trying to tap into the economic value of a terraformed Mars. I've seen some estimates that a fully terraformed Mars could be worth quadrillions of dollars, for instance, and that it might only cost on the order of about $2 trillion to complete a lot of the terraforming process. So this really is an issue that I suspect would probably drive a lot of the politics on Mars. And for any of you that are science fiction fans who might have seen The Expanse, for instance, which I really, really enjoy, then you'll know that the Martian society is there 200 years in the future in that particular novel and TV series, are obsessed with terraforming Mars. It's the single focal point of their society, making the red planet blue and green. So let me know in the comments, what do you think about terraforming and how might it influence the societies on Mars? I'm not looking at debates necessarily about whether terraforming is good or bad, but more about how that. I mean, do you think do you think a specific political architecture would be the most stable for terraforming Mars? And just to throw a devil's advocate argument out here, for instance, democracies, for instance, re-elect new leaders every 5 years or 4 years, for instance, in most developed countries. But is that necessarily the most stable system of government if you want to conduct a 200, 300 or 1,000-year project to terraform Mars? Perhaps a system similar to what you have in China would be better suited to that, for instance. To give an example, China have been embarked on a 70-year project to build aqueducts between the north and south of the country to ensure that they're readily adapted to climate change before it even hits, by pumping water from the water-rich southern regions to the northern regions. And a project of that length is probably not something that you see very often in democracies. We certainly see it a lot in absolute monarchies, like here in Cambridge and in Oxford in the United Kingdom. If you look at many of the really old buildings, the colleges, some of them took about 90 years to build. And they were built over successive kings and queens, for instance, because there was a single belief that united that. In that particular case, for many of these older buildings, which were churches and chapels, it was a religious belief. So maybe if the people on Mars all have the belief in terraforming Mars, that could be the uniting factor that could lead to long-scale projects on Mars being stable. I'm going to take a look at a few of your comments now, because there's quite a lot have come along. Kelchis says that Dune is also another good example from sci-fi, another series that I highly recommend you reading if you haven't taken a look already. The Capacitor says that we need an Emperor on Mars. So we probably won't see the title of Emperor on Mars, as cool as it sounds. If many of you have read some of Wernher von Braun's science fiction, you'll know that the supreme leader of Mars in, I think it was the Mars Project in 1957, was actually called the Elon. So there's a lot of in-jokes going around about Elon standing to be the Elon if he one day goes to Mars, for instance. So there's all manner of titles you could envision, but I would like to hope that we never see a single person just unilaterally governing Mars and then deciding on behalf of everyone else what would actually happen. Okay, some more of your points. I'm seeing loads of Expanse references in the comments, so thanks very much for that. In particular, we need to stay away from Ter Aqua now that we know that we have water lakes beneath the surface of Mars around the southern ice cap, as was recently revealed by the European Space Agency. So lots of very fascinating points that you're all seeing, and I wish I had more time to look at all of your comments. So one thing that I want to emphasize is an idea of a representative technocracy as a hybrid system, which, based on everything I've seen, is probably what I suspect would work best on Mars, although if you know of any obvious flaws with what I'm about to describe, by all means, please let me know in the comments. I'd be really interested to hear. The basic idea would be a hybrid system of a democracy on the one hand and a technocracy on the other hand. A pure technocracy would just say, experts know the best, let them decide everything, and you wouldn't have any elections. Democracy, on the other hand, obviously you have elections, and most of you will be familiar with that. So the idea would be, let's say, for instance, you have a democracy, but you elect people into specific jobs within the government. Instead of just electing people to represent a particular area, you would elect someone to be in charge of the agriculture in the Martian society. You would elect someone to be in charge of security. You would elect someone to be in charge of 3D printing, for instance, energy management. There's loads and loads of different roles vital on Mars. And maybe then you could impose some kind of restrictions in who could actually stand for the election, in terms of passing a basic competency test, for instance. But I think it's very important that you have a system where everyone is having a say. They are able to have representatives, but you still have competent people at every scale of the government. And one of the points we haven't actually touched so far is about political parties, which a few of you raised in comments, but it wasn't mentioned that often. As you know, there are some countries like China which just have a single governing party. In democracies, many tend to have either a two-party system, like we see in the United States, or multi-party systems where you have voting systems like proportional representation, such as we see in Germany and a number of European countries. So, do you think political parties are actually a good idea on Mars? Because if you have a representative technocracy, you don't necessarily need political parties. Because one of the problems that you can sometimes have with a political party system is, let's say you have someone, for the sake of argument, who is a genius at energy management. They've been in charge of that aspect of the colony for 20 years, and they have no interest in stopping. But they're affiliated with political party A. And then political party A falls out of fashion overall because of their overall policies. Maybe, for instance, the political party as a whole is against terraforming, for instance, and most people in the election favour it. That could then mean that this particular expert in the energy resource management could then lose their job, not because they're not good at their job, and not because people don't like them and want them to stay in there, but just because the party is not favoured. If you had a representative technocracy, you can then combine the best of both worlds, where if you have someone in a political party where the party falls out of favour, the individual person can then still be elected time after time again if people think they're doing a good job. So maybe that would be a system, but that's just my personal view. And obviously I'm always looking for ways to widen my beliefs based on new evidence. Okay, so a few more of your comments I will take a look at before we wrap up overall. And yes, I noticed a few of you talking about The Expanse, and I say please no spoilers overall in this chat feed for people who haven't had the chance to enjoy it just yet. So, Datonga says that a scientific veto may be required in the early settlement for at least 20 years, which sounds very similar to the kind of AI veto that I talked about earlier, where if an artificial intelligence calculates something that would be catastrophic to the survival of the settlement, they could have a veto. So, yes, in principle, anything that could dramatically harm the settlement, I think it's an excellent idea for someone knowledgeable to have a veto. Shane has just said that no system is perfect, which, absolutely, I think that's the most perfect comment that summarises almost everything. We've looked at a lot of ideas overall in this live stream, spanning everything from democracies, socialist systems, and AI-governed dictatorship, through to technocracies. We've looked at laws, constitutions. This is a huge topic, but I think it's especially important that we look at it now. Some of you will have heard recently that SpaceX have recently hosted a Mars workshop, for instance, looking at many of the technical problems associated with building a city on Mars, which is sorely overdue, and it's great to see happen. But it's not just the technical side we need to be thinking about. We still need to be thinking about how people themselves and society will work on Mars, which ultimately was the reason why I want to do this live stream. I will be I will be talking a lot more about SpaceX's Mars workshop, about the recent terraforming study that came out in my next Mars mission update, which will be coming out probably around the end of September, because I'm going to be moving house in about 2 weeks or so, and I'm going to be starting applying for my first proper academic jobs for when I finish my PhD in the next few months or so. So it's a quite busy time for me. That being said, I will be reading all of your comments both on this live stream, and there's a few comments on my last Mars mission update that I haven't had the chance to read yet that I will be getting through. I do take the time to read all your comments, even if it does take me a little bit longer than I would expect. So with that, I'm probably going to wrap up this live stream for now, because we've been going on for, I don't know, maybe 40 minutes or so. I hope you found it insightful, and I apologise if I haven't been able to get through to your particular comments on the live stream. So if you still have more views based on everything we've said, please, what I would encourage you to do, drop a comment down below in the saved version of this video, and if you're watching the catch-up, you're not too late, you can still comment, and I will be reading your comments and replying wherever possible. So with that, I'm probably going to sign off for now. I hope you've enjoyed this live stream. If you have any suggestions for how I could improve the live stream, please let me know. The reason I have this new microphone set up is because one of you suggested obtaining a new microphone to improve the quality of the audio, so I'm always looking for your suggestions. So with that, I'll sign off for now, and I'm looking forward to seeing you in the next Mars mission update at the end of September. Bye for now, everyone.